Traditionally, if you were writing Azure Functions as a C# project, then you would be doing some combination of a DLL in a hosted process that used a lot of magic to make things work. Not so anymore in the world of .NET 5. Let's mash on that.
Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we're going to ignore the Asp.Net part of our discussion and just go straight into Azure Functions and talk about isolated processes. So tell me everything, James.
I thought you were just going to say we're going to explore ignore the Asp.Net part and just be monsters, and I was okay with that too.
I'm always monstrous.
Okay, so here's the thing. I'm probably like way dramatically oversimplifying it, but there's a runtime for Azure Functions. And what we used to do is we'd install some dependencies, we'd take on some dependencies, we'd create a DLL, and then we'd put some attributes on our classes or on our functions to signal to the host that this was a method that was going to be invoked. We'd create some mappings back and forth, and then the host took care of, like the runtime took care of channeling things in and out, and it used things like output bindings, parameter bindings, and things like that, so that we could pass information around and even push data out into other queues and even into blob storage and things like that. The problem is that in this scenario, we don't have access to any of the startup bits. We don't have access to the configuring the middleware. We don't get DI, not traditionally anyways. We have to do kind of like the poor man's DI kind of thing where we new up a class at the start of the method call. And so what this gives us in .NET 5, and I'm assuming going forward, is the ability to run our own like to choose the .NET release version that we want to use, and then we get to control all of those things: startup, middleware, dependency injection, and we can configure that all on our own. However, it means that we lose some things that were really easy and trivial to do, but then I don't think it's necessarily that much more difficult, and it's probably a little bit more obvious as to what's going on as we move forward. So I've got the updated tooling installed. I'm here in Visual Studio Code. And so what I'm going to do is create a new functions project. And then it just prompts me through all these things. So I'm going to create a new one. I'm here in my folder that I want to be in for .NET 5 functions. I'm going to use C#. This is where I get to choose if I want to do the .NET Core 3, which is currently on the LTS, or I can pick the .NET 5 isolated, which is what we're talking about, where we get to control everything. And then what are we going to use? We're going to use an HTTP trigger just to get started, and we'll maybe just say trigger things off, I guess. Asp.NET monsters .samples just for my namespace. And then we're going to make this anonymous because we just don't want to tie into any of the auth stuff right now. And when go ahead.
Open to the world. Anybody can hit this endpoint now.
Open to the world. If you can access my IP address.
Well, I mean, kind of, right? So you still get, if you were doing protection at the hosting level, then you would still use an anonymous function, but there would be an authentication layer on top of that.
This is just skipping the check for API keys, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's ignoring like the function key and the admin key.
Perfect. So we've got our trigger things off, and what we'll do now is mute the phone call that's coming in, and I'm going to just actually pop back here, and we're going to run this guy. So I'm going to hit F5 to start debugging. So with the new tooling, there's a really cool integration that is aware of any running functions projects, and then we get to see the functions right here, and it's going to keep trying, and then it's going to figure things out. So I'm just going to pop back over, and there's the trigger things off. I can actually right click on it and execute function now, and I'm just going to type hello there. And of course we get this little message here. functions trigger things off has kicked off, and away we go. So at first blush, this doesn't look too different. I'm just going to increase the font size here a little bit so everybody can see. That should do. And as we can see here, it looks, there's a lot of things that look pretty close to what we used to see. However, we're now getting our logger out of the execution context rather than having that injected in. And we do have this new function context, which gives us access to a little bit more of what's going on. So there's a little bit of a change there. So I'm going to stop this right now. We're going to add, we'll have a just quick look at this project and see how things are a little bit different. So we've now got this program, and for anybody who builds in .NET Core already, if you're an Asp.NET developer, or if you do console apps using .NET Core, then you're probably familiar with this. So this is what allows us to build up our execution pipeline, and we could here, in this space, configure dependency injection and add middleware and all of those kinds of things. So that opens up a lot of doors that we didn't have before because we didn't control any of that. And then finally, I've got my the projects created here, and here is my method. So it's got an HTTP response data type. So in this particular case, we're writing back to whomever requested it. So we could run this in, kick it off via an HTTP request. Let me just do a couple of things now. Let's say that this message was actually, that was coming in, was actually something that we wanted to do some work with, like put it on a queue. So we want to put it into a queue, and then the queue is going to do something with it. Maybe it's going to take a couple of values in, look them up in a database, build a message, and then send an email out. So we'd want to put this message coming in out onto the queue, and then the queue is going to, we're going to have another function that's triggered off of messages from that queue. It does its processing and then sends the email off. We don't want to wait for that here in this HTTP trigger. So instead, we're going to pop over, and I'm going to add another function to this guy here. So this one is going to be a queue trigger, and we'll call this one I am triggered by things. And this will be Asp.NET monsters samples, and I will use it's just asking me for the name of the app setting that we want to use. I'm going to use the local storage, so it's going to prompt me for that right away. And if I don't have the storage emulator running, it's going to prompt me to get that running. So you might have some other stuff to download if you're going down this path. Basically, though, if you're already an Azure Functions author, you're going to have a lot of the tooling that you already need, maybe just the update for Visual Studio Code. Okay, so I need the process things queue. That's the name of the, make sure I'm doing that right. Yes, queue name. So that's the name of the queue. And then it says, in order to debug, you must select a storage account for internal use by the Azure Functions runtime. Now, what's kind of cool about this is if you're logged into Azure with the tooling in Visual Studio Code, it will actually let you pick from a subscription and target a particular storage account inside of a resource group, et cetera, et cetera. For now, I'm just going to use the local emulator, and it is creating this queue trigger for me, and away we go. It resolves some dependencies, and we're up and running. Now, this queue is not going to be populated with anything. And I'm going to make a really quick change here. I'm going to say I am triggered by things, process my queue item. So that way we're just going to be more clear when in the logging as to what actually happened. But so when this method is invoked, it's going to happen because something ended up on this queue. So now we want to add this to the queue. So back over here, what we would normally do, or what we would traditionally do, is we would put in another parameter here, an output binding in the HTTP response data. But we don't do that anymore. We actually have to change our approach on that, and we're going to add another attribute saying that there's going to be queue output. Queue output, and then we need to name the queue that we're going to be writing to, which is the process things queue. And then how do we actually, this starts to create a bit of a problem because we're trying to respond to this HTTP request. We still want to be able to send that response out, that HTTP status code OK out, but we also need to write to this queue. And the solution that they've come up with here is kind of clever. It was a little bit, I was a little bit suspect of it at first, but I actually kind of found that this is kind of a pretty decent idea. We're going to take this queue output off of the, I kind of, at first blush, I thought we were going to add it to an output. If I was doing something like, say, this is an HTTP trigger, which requires a different return type. But if I was doing something that was like a timer trigger, I could actually put the queue output right up here on my function. However, in this particular case, I'm going to need a new class. So I'm going to do a public class, and I'll do MultiOutput function info. I don't know, we'll just call it whatever we want to. And then I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to replace this HTTP response data, and we're going to put that down here as a property. So we'll do property HTTP response data, and we'll call that our response. And then we're also going to have a prop, let's say a string, and we'll call this our queue value. And we're going to put our queue output attribute on here, the process things queue. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to change the way that we do a response. So it's actually going to return multi-output function info. And so here I'm going to say new multi-output function info, and my queue value is going to be a message, and then my response is going to be the response we just created. Actually, I suppose, because we've got an incoming message here, I could probably even do this. Why don't we say request dot read as string, and that will be this will do is it will actually take whatever came in from that HTTP request, and it will actually set that as the queue value. And when the runtime now processes this function, it's going to look at this response value, and it's going to redirect these things. So I could add blob storage here, I could add multiple queues, I can do all kinds of things, and it's pretty clever if I had more than one value that I needed to write to, where we used to use like that collector, where we could write to that collector and then it would stuff those into a queue. Here I can just return an IEnumerable of string, and then I can just build up my a list of strings and then dump those in, and those would all be added one by each to the queue for me. So now when I run this, if I did everything correctly, go ahead.
How does it know which one is the HTTP response? Is it just by convention that it's named response, or is it looking at the type?
It must be evaluating the type. Dave, actually, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Why don't we try
works.
this? Yeah, let's say it just works. We'll give this a try, and then I'm going to rename the response after we run it one time. I think this will work like this though. Okay, so let's give this a try again. I'm going to F5 this bad boy. And I'm still in my Azure tooling. So now that I've started debugging, it's going to try and read this back out and figure out what is actually in my project. And then there is the trigger things off, and there is the I am triggered by things. I guess that should have been past tense. We're going to execute this, and I will say, hello, monsters. And now we're going to watch down here, because if things are wired up correctly, this is going to first get our Azure Functions welcome message here, which kind of sucks. But it will get this message. It's going to read this hello monsters in, pop it into the queue, and then the I am triggered by things queue triggered function should process this. And there they go. So trigger things off, and I am triggered by things from the new message in the process things queue. And it processed hello monsters, which if we go back and look at our code, is basically saying I am triggered by the queue item, or processed this message, the queue item, and the queue item indeed was hello monsters. If we want to just absolutely double check that, I don't know how to, there we go, look at that. I will just refresh my locally available queues, and what did I call it? Process things queue. Now back over here, if you just watch quickly, I should be able to, in here, add a message saying manually added queue item. And when I kick that off, there we go. Manually added queue item. So the wiring is all correct. It automatically created the queue for me in the storage account that I was using and all of those beautiful things. So again, the biggest difference is really going to be in your input and output bindings. But I think, as we'll show in another later episode with the dependency injection and some of the middleware bits that you can do, this is probably like a better system overall. And like we're no longer part of that integrated process, so we're going to run into fewer conflicts at runtime. We're not going to be run into like bumping our heads up against a particular version of some library that's referenced by the host. You don't have to. I ran into that earlier with things like image processing, where I had to take a dependency on a certain version of a system library or something like that, and it was a different stock library that was in Azure Functions. I think actually the first time I ran into that was in Newtonsoft JSON way back in the day. So this helps us avoid that by allowing us to control this startup pipeline and all of those things.
That's a really interesting model change for them. And I know that this was kind of a long time in coming, and this was partially because of how long it was taking the functions team to react to new versions of .NET.
Yeah.
That, like, I know, what was it, .NET 3 came out, and it took them like 6 months to support .NET 3. And so this should help them move a little bit more quickly on focusing on new versions of .NET, especially as the time between versions of .NET reduces. But I think there's some drawbacks to this approach too. So I know that startup time is longer for this. So the recommendation is that you run your functions on Linux, which apparently starts up a little bit faster, which suggests to me that there is some containerization happening behind the scenes, that Linux containers is faster to start up than Windows containers.
Right.
And there's some stuff, I think, also that isn't supported, like durable functions, I don't think are supported yet under the isolated process model. So it is a little bit of a trade-off. Like, this is still early days, and although this was like a full-featured .NET Functions release, there was certainly some reduction in functionality for this version. But version 3 still runs fine. So you can, if you still need that stuff, use the older version, but you're not going to be able to get some of the speed improvements, advantages that came in .NET 5 just yet. So I guess you could think of it as like, remember when Entity Framework was awesome, and then they released Entity Framework Core, and everything was terrible and nothing worked anymore. I don't think it's as bad as that, but it's that same sort of a step where we have to take a step backwards before we can start going forward again.
Yeah, it feels like there are some, like I really, the one thing that I always lament going into a functions project is the loss of DI, right? Like I want a more like a better way to compose my app and to put things in. And I understand, the purpose of functions is supposed to be smaller, but something as simple as connecting to a database there's a lot of grunt work every time you go to do that in a functions project.
So I mean that was possible in previous versions of functions, that you could register classes that would run at startup and reconfigure your container for you and allow you to inject additional things into your function. So it was possible, but it wasn't, I guess, the same way that you would do it for every other .NET project that we're doing now. So now we're moving to this sort of common hosting model for all .NET. Then in theory, until David Fowler changes it again, everything should start up and run sort of the same way across all projects.
Yeah, ultimately it should give us more flexibility, but yeah, it'll be a little while, I think, before things are caught up.
They have released a roadmap.
What was that, Simon?
I was saying I think they have released a roadmap or had some public discussions about roadmap, and I feel like we're probably like 6 months out on getting closer to feature parity. And I don't remember, but I feel like there are some bindings that don't work yet in the isolated process model, and I can't remember what they are, but I feel like Service Bus might have been one of them.
Okay. And there still will be a restriction on which runtimes can be used. So the only one that's currently supported out of process is .NET 5. So there's, like as other things are released, it looks like they're going to have to create something around that. So it probably won't eliminate entirely the lag. It'll just get them a little bit closer to the release date of those major releases.
I was really interested in that output bindings. I hadn't seen that before. I was wondering, you said if you turn it into a list of strings, then what gets sent back is a collection of objects. So if we turn that into like a enumerable,
yeah, let's do
I'm just curious to how this knows the difference between a bunch of messages that need to be sent and a message whose body is a collection of strings.
Yeah, I was wondering the same.
Sure. So let's say this is a new list of. I'm not going to be able to answer that question because I started typing and I wasn't listening. But we'll come back to that in a second. So I'll do also.
I've never stopped you before, James.
Hello, Simon.
This is how things go, right? Like people expect us to know what we're talking about, and half the time we just make it up during our discussions here.
It's all good. This is #experts. This is what we're here for. Okay, so how it knows to do the things, I imagine, so it must be inspecting the property, obviously, and it sees it's an enumerable, and because it's targeting a particular queue, it's just going to loop over, it's going to iterate over any of the items in that collection and push it out to the queue. These will all get pushed out as separate messages to the queue. I've tested this already. So this is the change that we need to make. So anything that we push in there now is also going to give us a hello, Simon. So maybe this just will demonstrate. It won't explain exactly the underlying.
Yeah. I don't expect you to be able to read the minds of the functions team. I'm just curious to see how this is going to work.
Yeah, for sure.
It seems really odd to me that it's like they're overloading this concept of an enumerable. Yeah, so processes 2 different messages.
Okay, and then the other thing that we had talked about was how does it know is this, like, so Q value was just something I totally made up. I have no idea, like, so it's not based off of the name of the property. So I'll just put like response-o-matic here, and my suspicion is that it's going to work. What would be the easiest way to test that? I guess I could do, I could write out my incoming request. And we could just echo that back out. Request string, and then we'll just put that here. And then I feel like, oh, right, it does need to know the response-o-matic. Should be good. So I'll run that again. I feel like it's going to work. I feel like it's going to know that this is the...
Yeah, I suspect it's just inspecting on the type rather than the name. That feels less fragile. I don't know what will happen if you put two HTTP response data properties.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that. So trigger thing is off, and then hello, Dave, and yeah, it did it. So
well, I sent the message. I said, did we? I haven't seen the response on this. You're going to have to hit it with like a post person request or something like that.
Post person.
Yeah, you can just do it in a browser. Yeah, post person.
Did they rename that? Did they rename it?
Bloody should rename it.
I think you're right.
Simon's been trying really hard to push that through.
Try and get that.
So far, adoption is trickling right around 0% on my efforts, though.
Okay, let's see.
We did have a comment on one of our videos. Somebody was asking why it couldn't be called Postman.
Oh, yeah. This is a debate I want to get into on YouTube.
I don't think it is. Okay, let me just new up a request here. The request name. Oh, no, I don't care about updates. It's probably telling me I'm outdated and I shouldn't be running in here anymore. Monsters test, and I will add it to random collection. Okay, so I'm going to hit it where?
It hurts.
Okay, and I'm going to put into my body.
Make it a post if you're putting a body there.
Is that?
You can put a body on a get.
You can, but it won't read it.
Really? I thought that was in spec.
So I did get my response back.
Cool.
Interesting.
How
does it know?
How does it know?
Well, it's just looking at the HTTP response data type.
Yeah.
I kind of expected to see.
It implies a lot of reflection going on.
Well, not necessarily. Like this could be doing code jam behind the scenes.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, I considered that.
Plus, supposedly there's a lot of work being done on reflection right now by the team to make it faster, which is interesting.
Making reflection great again.
I'm trying to remember a time when reflection was previously great, but
we're gonna put that on a hat. Okay, awesome. Okay, so there is still some pure magic happening in the world of Azure Functions, but now you get to control the magician a little bit deeper in the veins. So there we go. Ask your questions below. We'll fake our way through the answers, as always. And feel free to reach out. Remember to like, comment, and share. Do the subscribe, click the bell, make it ring, make it rain. We're on our way to 100,000 subscribers. So we can get that, that YouTube.
We're also on our way to 1 million.
We are. Hey.
Probably also on our way to 12.
Awesome. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.